My name is Rebecca Stanton. I am 41 years old. And on the 14th of March, at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon, I stood in the parking lot of the Missoula County Federal Building and watched two agents from the United States Fish and Wildlife Service walk my sister Diane out of the county recorder's office in handcuffs, past 43 members of her wedding party, past a florist still holding an armful of white peonies, past the photographer who had driven in from Billings and was now standing with his mouth open and his camera hanging uselessly around his neck. The handcuffs were standard issue, black, utilitarian. They caught the afternoon sun for just a second as she passed under the awning, and I noticed that because I notice things. I always have. Diane did not look at me when she passed. She looked straight ahead the way people do when they are trying to convince themselves that what is happening is not actually happening. Her veil was still pinned to her hair, white tulle, small seed pearls along the edge. She had shown it to me 6 months earlier, held it up against the window light in her living room and asked if it was too much. I had said it was beautiful. I had meant it. I did not feel triumphant standing there in that parking lot. I want to be precise about that. What I felt was something more like the quiet that follows a long storm, when the air has finally stopped moving and you can hear your own heartbeat again. When the sound of rain has been going on so long that silence itself feels almost strange. I had known this moment was coming for 11 months. I had built it brick by brick in the dark, while she laughed at dinner tables and signed papers that were not hers to sign, while she called my inheritance worthless and told anyone who would listen that I was the sister who got the broken thing. What she did not know was that the broken thing was a federally designated critical habitat corridor for 2 threatened species, protected under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, and that the moment she forged my signature and filed that deed transfer with the county recorder, she had not just betrayed her sister, she had committed a federal crime. This is that story. Before we go any further, I want to stop and ask you something simple and genuine. What part of the world are you in right now? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments below, because I love knowing that these stories travel, that a woman in a small apartment in Montana can say something that reaches someone across an ocean, someone who has felt the same thing. If this kind of story speaks to you, if you believe that quiet women are often the most dangerous ones, please like this video and subscribe to Revenge Chronicles. Every single subscriber tells us to keep going, and we read your comments, every one. I grew up in a family where the word fair was used often and meant almost nothing. My father, Thomas Stanton, was a civil engineer who spent 30 years working for the Montana Department of Transportation, a methodical man who believed that precision was a form of love. He was not warm in the conventional sense. He did not hug easily or say "I love you" without being prompted. But he remembered everything. He remembered the exact date I passed my nursing boards, the 2nd of August, a Tuesday. He remembered the name of my first patient at St. Patrick Hospital in Missoula, a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher named Gerald Fowler who had congestive heart failure and a passion for crossword puzzles. My father remembered because he paid attention, and paying attention was his language. My mother, Linda Stanton, née Kowalski, was a woman who had learned early that beauty opened doors and charm kept them open. She was 58 years old when this story begins, still blonde in the way that requires appointments every 6 weeks, still the woman who entered a room and recalibrated it simply by arriving. She had grown up in Butte, the youngest of 4 daughters, and she had made it out through a combination of beauty school and a marriage to my father that she described, in her warmer moments, as the best strategic decision she had ever made. She loved Diane the way you love a reflection of yourself. I understood it even when it stung. Diane at 38 was my mother made younger. Quick to laugh, confident in crowds, allergic to the kind of silence that I had always found comfortable. I was something else entirely. Diane worked in marketing for a mid-sized tech firm in Missoula called Bridgepoint Solutions. She made $84,000 a year and spent $91,000. A gap she bridged with a rotating set of credit cards that she referred to collectively as the situation, in a tone that suggested the situation was manageable and someone else's problem. She had been engaged twice before Marcus Hale came along. The first engagement had ended when she was 26, because the man, a contractor named Jeff Bergstrom, had moved to Portland. The second had lasted 4 months and dissolved over what Diane described only as irreconcilable priorities. Marcus was different. Marcus was 43, a commercial real estate developer with a firm jaw and a habit of speaking loudly in restaurants, as though he wanted the neighboring tables to benefit from his opinions. He had a firm called Clearwater Ridge Development LLC registered in Montana, and he presented the appearance of wealth with the kind of consistency that requires either significant resources or significant discipline. He had met Diane at a charity auction for the Missoula Food Bank in September of the year before all of this happened. By February, they were engaged. By April, the wedding planning had become the gravitational center around which our entire family orbited. I, Rebecca Stanton, was a registered nurse working in the cardiac intensive care unit at St. Patrick Hospital. I had been there for 14 years. I had held the hands of people who were frightened. I had explained procedures in plain language to families who needed honesty more than comfort. I had worked the night shift for 6 of those 14 years, from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, in a unit where the monitors never stop and the light never fully darkens. I owned a 700-square-foot apartment on Higgins Avenue in Missoula, second floor east-facing, with a window that let in the morning sun when I was sleeping after a night shift, and which I had eventually learned to regard not as an obstacle but as a reminder that the world continued on its schedule whether I was rested or not. I drove a 2013 Subaru Outback with a cracked passenger side mirror that I had been meaning to replace for 2 years and never had. I was, by every external measure, the modest one, the sensible one, the one who did not need much. That was the story my family had agreed on without quite saying so, and I had spent years deciding whether to argue with it or simply let it be the story, while I became, quietly and without announcement, something else entirely. Our father died on the 6th of November, 3 years before this story begins. He died in the cardiac unit at the same hospital where I worked, which was not a coincidence so much as a convergence. He had known his heart was failing for 2 years before it did. He had spent those 2 years in the methodical way he spent everything, updating his affairs, reviewing his investments, meeting twice with his attorney Douglas Penfield of Penfield and Associates on North Higgins. His will was 18 pages long. He had reviewed it on the 29th of October and again on the 4th of November. He died on the 6th. He left the house on Rattlesnake Creek Road to my mother outright. He left his pension payout and his savings account, which together totaled $212,000, split evenly between Diane and me, and he left me, specifically and exclusively and in language that Douglas Penfield told me was unusually precise even by estate planning standards, the cabin. The cabin sat on 47 acres of Douglas fir and creek bottom meadow in the Blackfoot River corridor, 11 miles east of Ovando, Montana, a small town with a population of 73, and a bar and a post office and a landscape that stopped the breath of anyone who arrived without being prepared for it. My father had bought the property in 1987 for $32,000 from a rancher named Ed Clearwater, who was moving his family to Arizona and who had shaken my father's hand in the parking lot of the Garnet Mountain Bar and Grill and said, "Dat creek will outlast everything." The cabin itself was a hand-built log structure of 900 square feet, with a working well, a wood stove, a sleeping loft with 2 small windows facing east, a porch that ran the full length of the front, and no cell service. My father had taken me there alone for the first time when I was 9 years old. He had shown me how to read a topographic map, spread out on the kitchen table with a headlamp in the dark because the generator had stopped working that afternoon, and he had not brought a backup. He had shown me how to identify elk tracks in the mud along the creek, how to tell a fresh print from a day-old one by the crispness of its edges. He had shown me how to sit still long enough that the world forgot you were watching, which is a skill that almost no one teaches children and which turns out to be one of the most useful things a person can know. He never took Diane. I do not know if that was intentional or incidental. I only know that the cabin was the one place on earth where I felt entirely like myself. What the cabin looked like to everyone else in the family was a liability. When the will was read in Douglas Penfield's conference room on the 14th of November, 2 weeks after the funeral, Diane had made a sound when she heard the cabin clause, a small exhaled breath that was not quite a word and not quite not a word, somewhere between disbelief and the beginning of an argument she was deciding whether to start. She had not started it in the conference room, she had saved it for the car. On the drive home, she said to my mother, "It doesn't even have internet." My mother had said, "Your father always had his reasons," in a tone that suggested she found his reasons eccentric but not worth fighting. I had sat in the back seat and looked out the window at the November mountains going bare at their tops and said nothing. I was very good at saying nothing in those years. I had been practicing. Over the following 2 years, the cabin appeared in the family's conversation at intervals that grew shorter as Marcus Hale became more central to Diane's life. Not because anyone wanted to use it, but because Marcus, as a commercial real estate developer, had done enough research into the Blackfoot River corridor to understand that undeveloped land in that area had been appreciating at rates that would have seemed implausible 5 years earlier. Conservation buyers, outdoor recreation investors, private landowners seeking quiet acreage away from development, they had all been moving into that part of Montana, and the values had moved with them. Marcus had mentioned it at Thanksgiving dinner of the year before the wedding, casually, the way people mention things they have been considering for months. "That land of yours out by the Blackfoot," he had said, reaching across my mother to refill his wine glass without asking. "There are developers who would pay real money for that. Conservation buyers too, if development isn't your thing. You know that, right, Rebecca?" I had said, "I know." I had not said anything else. He had said, with the specific kind of expansiveness that men use when they are explaining something to a woman they believe does not understand it, "I could make some calls, get you some numbers, just so you know what you're sitting on." I said, "That's kind of you." I ate a piece of pie. I did not pick up the thread he had left there for me to pick up. The specific incident that I mark as the breaking point, the moment I understood that what was coming was no longer theoretical, came on a Friday evening in the last week of January. 7 months before the scheduled wedding, Diane appeared at my apartment door at 6:43 in the evening unannounced, which was itself unusual enough to register. Diane did not do unannounced. She did curated arrivals, texts 20 minutes in advance, questions like "Are you home?" that were really statements of impending arrival. She was wearing a camel-colored wool coat I had not seen before, and carrying a bottle of Argentinian Malbec. And she sat down at my kitchen table and poured 2 glasses without being asked and said, "I need to talk to you about money." The wedding, she explained, had grown. Marcus's side of the guest list had expanded to 180 people when several of his business associates and their families had been added in January. The venue they had chosen, a converted historic barn outside Lolo that a couple had spent 4 years restoring, cost $11,000 for the weekend rental. The catering was $42 per head excluding alcohol, and Diane had decided the bar should be open. The photographer from Billings, a man named Scott Willard who had shot 3 weddings that had been featured in Montana Bride magazine, was $3,800 and an additional $400 for the travel day. There were flowers, white peonies and eucalyptus that Diane had chosen with a florist on Brook Street, and a string quartet from the University of Montana that was playing the ceremony for $1,200, and a rehearsal dinner at the Double Front Chicken for 40 guests. Marcus had already booked and paid for the honeymoon, 12 days in Tuscany, with a villa outside Siena, and that had cleaned out most of what Diane called their cash position. She needed $40,000. She had done the math. She had written it on a piece of yellow legal paper that she slid across the table to me, and I looked at the numbers, and they were accurate. She was asking me to sell the cabin. I looked at my glass of wine. I said, "Diane, I'm not selling the cabin." She looked at me the way she had looked at things our entire childhood that she had decided were wrong answers to questions she had already made up her mind about. "It's just sitting there," she said. "You go up there 4 times a year. You go up there and you sit on the porch by the creek, and you come back. You don't rent it. You don't do anything with it. It's 47 acres of trees and 1 dead generator. The generator was fixed in September, I said. She made a small sound. Rebecca. It was Dad's, I said. Dad is gone, she said. Not unkindly. Just factually, the way she said most things that were difficult. It was one of her qualities that I had always found both admirable and chilling. I said, I know. I'm not selling it. She was quiet for a moment. She refilled her wine glass. She said, Marcus thinks it could go for somewhere between 80 and 120,000 in the current market. We could split it with you. You'd get 60,000 minimum. That's more than you paid for your car and your apartment combined, Rebecca. That's real money. I said, I know what real money is. She said, so you're just going to keep it for the creek. I said, yes. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, with a precision that I recognized as something she had prepared before she arrived, You know that Marcus has contacts in conservation too. Even if you don't want to sell to a developer, there are organizations that pay for conservation easements. You don't have to give it up. You just leverage it. I said, I'm not interested in leveraging it. She finished her wine. She said, I hope you change your mind. She put on her coat and left. And I sat at the kitchen table for a long time afterward, looking at her glass with its small crescent of lipstick on the rim, and I felt something clarify inside me, with a quietness that was almost physical, like a lens coming into focus after a long blur. Not anger, something quieter and more lasting, more deliberate. I picked up my phone and called Douglas Penfield the next morning at 9 o'clock and made an appointment. What I want to say before I go further is that what happened next was not the result of suspicion or strategy. Not initially. It was the result of precision. I wanted to understand, fully and legally, what I owned. That was all. I did not set a trap. I did not surveil my sister. What I did was consult the people who knew things I did not yet know, and what they told me changed everything I understood about the ground I was standing on. Douglas Penfield had handled my father's estate. He was 61, careful in the way that good attorneys are. A man who kept a legal pad at the same angle on his desk every time you sat across from him, and who wrote in a hand so small, and even it looked typeset. I told him I wanted to understand the full legal status of the cabin, the title, the deed, any encumbrances, any regulatory designations at the county, state, or federal level. He said he would have a full title and regulatory report prepared within 10 business days. I said thank you, and drove home. I went to work the next morning at 6:45 and inserted a central line into a 64-year-old retired railroad worker named Daniel O'Coffer, who had just come through triple bypass surgery, and I charted his vitals with the steadiness that 14 years in a cardiac ICU had given me, the steadiness that comes from understanding that the moment in front of you is the only moment that matters. 14 days later, Douglas Penfield called me at 4:17 in the afternoon. He said, Rebecca, this is considerably more interesting than I expected. He told me that in 2019, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service had conducted a habitat assessment of the Blackfoot River corridor following a petition from 2 conservation organizations and a review of population data. For 2 threatened species, the bull trout, a fish whose populations in the upper Blackfoot had been declining for 2 decades, and the western toadlet, a small amphibian whose breeding habitat requirements were highly specific and increasingly rare. My 47 acres fell almost entirely within the resulting designated critical habitat zone. That designation, he explained, had been properly recorded with the county as a regulatory encumbrance, but it had never generated the kind of attention that would have made it into casual conversation. The designation meant that any sale or transfer of the property required notification to and review by the Fish and Wildlife Service. Any development or significant alteration of the designated habitat was prohibited under federal law. The land could not be subdivided. It could not be built on. It could not be converted to agricultural use. The value of the property on the open market was not, as Marcus Hale had framed it to Diane, a windfall for a developer, because no developer could do with it what developers do. The land's value was of a different kind, measurable in conservation easements and federal mitigation credits, in the kind of currency that conservation buyers and federal agencies understand, and that commercial real estate developers do not always bother to learn before they reach across a dinner table. Refill their wine glass. I thanked Douglas and sat with that information for exactly 1 week before I made 2 more phone calls. The first was to Patricia Wren, a conservation attorney in Helena with 15 years of experience in federal environmental law, whose name Douglas had given me. The second was to the regional office of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service in Helena. I explained the situation in both calls with as much precision as I could manage. Patricia Wren said, "How did your father come to own this property?" I told her about Ed Clearwater and the parking lot handshake in 1987. She said, "And he knew about the designation?" I said I was not certain yet. She said, "Find out." I said I would. And then I waited. I went to work. I monitored cardiac rhythms on screens that beat in patterns I had learned to read the way a musician reads music, distinguishing normal from abnormal, stable from deteriorating. At a glance, I adjusted medication drip rates on portable pumps. I sat with a 67-year-old woman named Patricia Hensley while she waited for her husband to come out of a second surgery, and I did not offer her false comfort or hollow reassurance. I said, "He is in the best hands in this building," because I believed that to be true, and I held her hand and I listened. I drove up to the cabin on the first Saturday of March. The snow was still deep along the north-facing slopes, 2 feet on the level and deeper in the draws. The creek was running fast and dark beneath a skin of ice at its edges, the current strong enough from the snowmelt that you could hear it 10 yards from the bank. I sat on the porch in a down coat and watched 2 common mergansers work their way upstream, the female's rust-brown head bright against the dark water. I ate a sandwich. I watched the light move across the ridge to the south. I drove back to Missoula in the dark. On the 9th of March, Douglas Penfield called me again at 2 in the afternoon. He said, "Rebecca, I need you to come in." His voice had a quality I had not heard from him before. Something precise and controlled, the way a person sounds when they are carrying the weight of information they know will change the shape of your afternoon and are managing the release of it carefully. I drove to his office on North Higgins. I sat across from him at the desk. He placed a file folder in front of me and opened it and turned it toward me without speaking first, which told me everything I needed to know about what was inside. Inside was a copy of a deed transfer, filed with the Missoula County Recorder's Office on the 22nd of February, conveying the 47-acre parcel in the Blackfoot River Corridor, Township 14 North, Range 12 West, from Rebecca Ann Stanton to Clearwater Ridge Development LLC, a company registered in Montana with Marcus Hale listed as the sole managing member. The grantor's signature on the deed was mine, or rather, it was someone's rendering of mine, produced with enough competence to pass a cursory review, on a document that had been notarized by a seal-reading Glenn Shipley, Notary Public, Missoula County, Montana, whose commission Douglas had confirmed had lapsed 14 months before the document was signed. The recorded sale price was $62,000. The funds had been wired to a joint account belonging to Diane Stanton and Marcus Hale on the 23rd of February. 5 days later, on the 28th, a payment of $11,000 had been made from that account to the Lolo Barn venue as a full deposit for the wedding rental. I looked at the deed for a long time. I looked at my name in someone else's hand. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or make a sound. I asked Douglas, "What are the specific exposure levels?" He said, "Federal and significant. The fish and wildlife violation triggers civil penalties of up to $37,500 per violation per day that the invalid transfer remains on the record. The forged instrument is a separate criminal matter at both the state and federal level, depending on how the U.S. Attorney's Office elects to prosecute. The notarization by an expired notary is a separate actionable violation, and Marcus Hale's LLC, by accepting and recording a transfer of a federally designated property without conducting the required regulatory review, either knew what it was doing or failed in due diligence to a degree that is itself actionable. He paused and looked at me over his legal pad. This is not a small problem for them. I said, no, it is not. Patricia Wren was already retained. I asked Douglas to coordinate with her immediately and to initiate the formal complaint to the Fish and Wildlife Service, which I had already begun through my call to the regional office 11 days earlier. The federal process had been moving. The county recorder's office had been notified of a potential disputed transfer pending investigation. The deed sat in the records flagged. Marcus Hale and Diane did not know that. They were, in those final 5 days before the wedding, entirely absorbed in the logistics of celebration. The Billings photographer had confirmed his travel. The string quartet had confirmed their music. The florist on Brook Street was processing the final peony order, and the woman whose name had been signed to a federal property without her knowledge was sitting in a law office on North Higgins, looking at a piece of paper and saying nothing. If you are still with this story right now, I want to pause and ask something of you. Hit that subscribe button if you have not already done it. Stories like this one exist because you come back for them. This community is built on women who refuse to be the quiet footnote in someone else's story, and every subscriber, every comment, every share tells us that what we are doing matters. Drop a comment below and tell me something specific. Have you ever had something taken from you by someone who assumed you would simply accept it? I want to read every single one. The 14th of March was a Saturday. The wedding was scheduled to begin at 3 o'clock in the afternoon at the converted barn outside Lolo. The rehearsal dinner had been held at the double front the night before. I had said I was working the overnight shift. I was not working the overnight shift. I had arranged coverage. I was at the Federal Building in downtown Missoula at 8 o'clock in the morning. In a conference room with Special Agent Carol Dempsey of the Fish and Wildlife Service and Assistant United States Attorney Kevin Marsh reviewing the complaint documents, the certified copy of the forged deed, the chain of evidence that Douglas and Patricia had assembled, the timeline of the transfer and the wire and the venue deposit. Patricia Wren was present. Douglas Penfield was present by phone, his voice steady and precise through the speakerphone at the center of the table. Kevin Marsh had an unhurried manner of speaking that I recognized and respected. The manner of someone who has done this long enough to know that haste produces errors and that thoroughness is always the more efficient choice. He said, "The service of process and the federal stop order on the property transfer will occur today. The ongoing daily accrual of federal penalties makes delay inadvisable." He looked at me. "You've indicated you want to be present at the time of service." I said yes. He said, "That is your right. I want to make sure you understand that we cannot guarantee how this will unfold publicly. The subjects have not been notified of today's action." I said I understood. Carol Dempsey said, "Miss Stanton, do you want to say anything to your sister before we proceed?" I said, "No." She nodded. I drove from the Federal Building to a parking spot on West Broadway with a view of the county recorder's office entrance and parked at 12:44 in the afternoon. I did not know exactly when the wedding party would arrive. What I knew was that Marcus had requested a certified copy of a document from the recorder's office, a document related to the deed transfer, and that his wedding coordinator had scheduled the pickup for the early afternoon as part of the day's logistics. I did not know there would be 43 people. That part I had not anticipated, but I had learned, in 14 years of cardiac nursing, that you prepare for what you can control and you stay steady when the rest surprises you. They arrived at 2:31 in the afternoon. I watched from across the street. Diane was in her dress, an ivory gown with a deep back and a full skirt that moved when she walked. Marcus was in a charcoal suit with a white boutonniere. The wedding party came in 2 SUVs and a rented van, and they spilled into the parking lot with the particular energy of people who are hours away from a celebration and who have been buoyed by rehearsal dinner champagne and the gathering momentum of a wedding day. Kelly Park, the maid of honor, was holding a bundle of white peonies, because the florist's delivery to the barn had run long and Kelly had volunteered to carry extras. The photographer, Scott Willard, was moving through the group with his camera, doing what documentary wedding photographers do, which is to capture the texture of the day in all its ordinary moments, so that the couple can look back later and see not just the ceremony but the life around it. At 2:47, Special Agents Carol Dempsey and Tomas Reyes walked out of the federal building entrance and crossed to the county recorder's lobby. I watched from my car. I did not go inside. I did not need to be inside. What I know of the next 8 minutes, I know from what Carol Dempsey told me afterward, from what Patricia Wren relayed, from what I could observe through the glass of the lobby entrance from across the street. Agent Dempsey presented Diane with a federal civil enforcement notice and a criminal referral summons. Agent Reyes simultaneously presented Marcus Hale with a notice of federal stop order on the deed transfer of the parcel in Township 14 North, Range 12 West, and a separate summons pertaining to the activities of Clearwater Ridge Development LLC in connection with the filing. Marcus spoke first. He said something about procedural error, and his attorney, whose name was Gerald Fitch of Fitch and Barlow on Toole Avenue, Tevin Marsh, who had positioned himself inside the lobby, stepped forward and addressed the procedural error point with the quiet comprehensiveness of a man who has answered that objection before. Marcus fell silent. Diane, according to Carol Dempsey, said nothing at all for 45 seconds. She stood with her bouquet held in front of her with both hands. And then she said in a voice that Kelly Park later described to me as completely flat, like she forgot how to make her voice go up, she said, "This is not happening." Carol Dempsey said, "Ma'am, I understand this is difficult timing." The criminal referral summons carried provisions requiring custody given the documented evidence of a forged notarized instrument, a specific circumstance that moved the matter from civil to criminal territory in a way that had consequences for how the agents were required to proceed. When they produced the handcuffs, the parking lot outside the lobby went entirely quiet. I watched from across the street. Kelly Park stopped walking mid-step. The florist, a young woman in a green apron with blossom and branch embroidered on the pocket, stopped and stood still with her armful of peonies held against her chest. The two violinists from the string quartet, who had arrived in a separate vehicle, were standing near the back of the rented van. They did not move. Scott Willard, the photographer from Billings, was near the front steps. He had not put his camera down because no one had told him to, and because the day's documentation had not technically ended. Diane walked through the lobby door and out under the awning in handcuffs, with Carol Dempsey beside her. She walked past Kelly Park. She walked past the florist. She walked through 43 people who had driven from Missoula and Lolo and Hamilton, and one couple from out of state to witness a ceremony that was no longer going to happen in the way anyone had planned. Her veil was still pinned to her hair. The seed pearls along the edge caught the afternoon sun as she passed under the awning, and she did not look at me, and I did not move from where I stood. And the air in that parking lot had a quality I do not have a word for. The quality of a moment that everyone present knows they will remember for the rest of their lives. I stood very still until the car door closed behind her. Then I walked to my Subaru. I drove home on I-90 West and then south on Higgins. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table in the quiet of a Saturday afternoon and listened to the ordinary sounds of the city outside my window. The traffic on Higgins, the distant sound of the Clark Fork running high with snowmelt, the particular piece of a day that has arrived at the end of a very long road. In the weeks that followed, the full architecture of what Diane and Marcus had done became visible in the way that financial wreckage always does, in stages, each one revealing another layer beneath it. The $62,000 had been largely spent. The venue deposit was $11,000 and non-refundable under the contract terms Diane had signed. The catering prepayment was 60% of the total, $12,480, also non-refundable. The Billings photographer had been paid in full. The string quartet had been paid in full. The Tuscany villa was gone. Marcus's LLC faced federal civil penalties that Patricia Wren assessed conservatively at $114,000, based on the per-day accrual from the filing date of the transfer on the 22nd of February to the issuance of the stop order on the 14th of March, a period of 20 days. And the calculation of which violations were distinct under the statute. The criminal forgery charge against Diane carried a potential sentence of up to 5 years under Montana state law. The U.S. Attorney's Office indicated early in the process that a plea agreement and full restitution would produce a different outcome. But the process was the process, and it moved on its own schedule. My mother called me on the morning of the 16th of March. She said, "Rebecca, there must be something you can do to stop this." I sat at my kitchen table with my tea going cold, and I said, "Mom, there is nothing I would undo about what has happened, and I think you know why." She was quiet. I said, "Diane forged my name on a federal property transfer. I didn't create that situation. I only made sure it was addressed." My mother said, in a voice that had lost some of its usual authority, "She was desperate." I said, "I know, but desperation is not a defense in federal law, and it doesn't make the deed less real." My mother said, "She's your sister." I said, "I know that. I have always known that. Those two things are both true at the same time." There was a long pause, and then my mother said something I did not expect. She said, "Your father would have handled this exactly the way you did." I did not respond to that. I said goodbye and hung up and sat for a long time without moving. Diane called me on the 5th of April, 22 days after the wedding that did not happen. She called at 7:16 in the evening. She said my name and then she stopped, and I could hear her breathing, and I waited without speaking. She said, "I don't know what I was thinking." I said, "I think you were thinking it would work." She said, "I'm sorry, Rebecca. I'm genuinely sorry." Her voice was different. Not smaller exactly, more precisely itself. The performance of confidence had been removed, and what was underneath was something I recognized from when we were children, from the sister she had been before she learned that brightness was a strategy. I said, "I know you are." I said, "I need you to work with your attorney and cooperate fully with Patricia Wren's office. I need you to make this right in the way the law requires it to be made right. That's what I need from you right now." She said she would. She did. The formal plea was entered on the 18th of May. Diane pled guilty to forgery in the 2nd degree and to fraudulent filing of a public record. The sentence was 3 years of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, and full financial restitution to me in the amount of $62,000, to be paid over a period of 36 months. Marcus Hales, LLC, settled the federal civil penalties through a consent decree negotiated between Gerald Fitch and the U.S. Attorney's Office for $91,000 paid in 2 installments. The engagement between Diane and Marcus was dissolved formally in April, 2 weeks after the federal consent decree was signed. I do not know what their private conversations looked like in those weeks. I do not need to know. The cabin is still mine. The deed transfer was invalidated by court order on the 28th of March. The property sits in the Blackfoot River corridor in exactly the condition it has always sat. In early June, I completed the formal negotiation with the Nature Conservancy of Montana for a permanent conservation easement on the 47 acres. The easement preserves the corridor indefinitely, prohibiting development in perpetuity, which was, as Patricia Wren noted in her closing memo, what the federal designation had already required. The Nature Conservancy's payment to me for the easement was $228,000, reflecting the land's assessed value not as a development parcel, but as a functioning, federally protected piece of the upper Blackfoot ecosystem. I did not need the money. I have always lived within what I earn. But I understood what the payment meant. It meant the land would remain the land, formally, legally, permanently, and that I would be the one who made that happen. My father knew about the federal designation. I found the letter in his filing cabinet 3 months after the legal proceedings concluded. It was in a folder labeled with my name in his handwriting, not labeled cabin or Blackfoot or property. Labeled with my name, tucked between a copy of my nursing license and a folded topographic map of the area around Ovando with a section of the creek marked in pencil. The letter was from the Fish and Wildlife Service, dated the 19th of September of 2019, informing the landowner of the habitat assessment results and the critical corridor classification, and explaining the regulatory implications in clear, bureaucratic language. My father had read that letter and filed it in a folder with my name on it. He had not mentioned it. He had not revised his will, because the will already said what he wanted it to say. He had simply paid attention, and then he had put the information where he knew I would eventually find it. I do not know if he anticipated what would happen. He was not a man who made predictions about human behavior. He was a man who prepared for outcomes. There is a difference, and he understood it. I drove up to the cabin on the first Saturday in May, 1 week after the conservation easement paperwork was filed. The snow had come off the open slopes but still held in the shadows of the north-facing draws. The creek was running high and fast, brown with snowmelt, loud enough to hear from the porch the moment you stepped outside. The meadow at the north end of the property had begun to green, a thin, bright green, just visible under the matted grass of the previous year. I walked down to the creek and stood on the bank for a while and watched the water. I thought about the bull trout moving somewhere in the current, invisible, going about the old business of survival. I thought about the western toadlets in the meadow, just beginning to stir in the warming earth. I thought about a 9-year-old girl sitting on this same porch in the September dark with a headlamp and a topographic map, learning for the first time what it felt like to understand exactly where she was. I sat on the porch for 3 hours. I made coffee on the wood stove. I listened to the creek and the wind in the fir trees and the sound of a red-tailed hawk somewhere over the ridge to the east. I did not think about the federal building or the handcuffs or Diane's veil or the parking lot full of people with white peonies. I thought about what my father had known and when he had known it and what he had decided, without telling me, to do about it. He had done exactly what I would have done. He had paid attention. He had filed the information where it needed to be. He had trusted me to find it when the time came. What I have come to understand in the months since the legal proceedings concluded is that the people who dismiss you are nearly always working from an assumption that is so fixed they do not even recognize it as an assumption. They assume that your silence is absence. They assume that because you are not performing your strength, you must not have any. They look at 47 acres of Douglas fir and creek bottom meadow and see a liability, a broken thing, trees and no internet, a failed inheritance from an eccentric father. They do not see what a man who paid attention left there for you to find. They do not see what you have been building in the hours when no one was watching. I am not angry at Diane. I want to say that clearly and without qualification. Anger requires fuel, and I have stopped feeding it. What I feel is something more like sorrow for the version of her that believed taking from me was the only available path forward. The version that had spent so many years measuring herself against the wrong scale that she had lost the ability to see what was actually in front of her. I feel sorrow for the years she spent believing that I was the sister who got the broken thing, when what I had actually been given was the thing that outlasted everything. The creek will outlast everything. Ede Clearwater said that in a parking lot in 1987, and he was right. And my father knew it, and now so does everyone else. To anyone watching this who has had their name used without permission, whose quietness was mistaken for passivity, whose inheritance was called worthless by someone who did not know what they were looking at, whose steadiness was confused for weakness, I want to say this simply. Knowing what you have, fully and precisely and without apology, is its own kind of power. You do not have to perform your strength for it to be real. You do not have to announce what you are building for it to stand. The people who underestimate you are giving you something. They are giving you time. Use it the way my father would have used it. Pay attention. File things carefully. Trust yourself to find what you need to find when you need to find it. And now I have a question for you. If someone had dismissed something precious to you as worthless, not knowing its true value, not knowing what they were really looking at, what would you have done? Would you have explained it? Would you have stayed silent? Would you have done what I did? Tell me in the comments, and tell me honestly, because I read every single one. I want to take a moment, genuinely, to thank every single one of you who is still here. You stayed through this entire story, and that means something real to me. Revenge. Chronicles is built by 3 of us, and every day we come back to these stories because of listeners like you. people who understand that the most powerful stories are not always the loudest ones. They are the ones told with steady hands and clear eyes by women who decided, quietly and without announcement, to stop being underestimated. We are a team of 3 who believe every woman's story deserves to be told. With the help of AI narration and storytelling, we bring these powerful, real-inspired stories to life every single day here on Revenge Chronicles, where the quietest women deliver the loudest outcomes. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Not because you want them to watch a video, but because you know someone who has been standing in a parking lot carrying something that everyone else called worthless. And you want them to know they are not alone. Hit subscribe, leave a comment, come back tomorrow, we will be here. The loudest comebacks are built in silence. What I have also come to understand is something quieter, something I do not say often. The cabin changed me in the years I had it before any of this happened. 4 times a year, I drove the 83 miles from Missoula to Ovando on a road that became gravel for the last 11 miles. And I arrived at a place that had no signal and no schedule and no one's expectations of me, and I sat with who I actually was, rather than who I was required to be everywhere else. That is not nothing. In fact, I think it might be everything. The capacity to know yourself, without interruption, without the ambient noise of what other people think you are, is the most durable thing a person can build. My father knew that. He gave me the cabin because he understood that I needed a place to know myself in, and that Diane did not need the same thing in the same way, and that fairness and sameness are not synonyms, and that a man who has spent his life paying attention knows the difference. The conservation easement closes formally on the 1st of September. The Nature Conservancy will hold the easement in perpetuity. The 47 acres will remain the 47 acres. The bull trout will move through the creek without knowing what was decided on their behalf. The western toadlets will breed in the meadow in April because that is what they do, because the habitat is there and intact and will remain so. I will drive up 4 times a year, probably more now. I will sit on the porch. I will make coffee on the wood stove. I will read the topographic map even though I have long since memorized it, because reading it is not about finding your way. It is about remembering that you know where you are.